what I'm most interested in is actually getting feedback from the families on some possible trial designs for future trials of vitamin D. That's actually where I think going to be a challenge of a design project. So, um, see here, I hooked up here with a. No problem. Oh, here we go. Okay. Um, so I've got disclosures here. I don't have any that are like I'm not going to make money off of the vitamin D work other than getting grant funding. So, but I want to thank some generous donors, the Rivederci ALD Foundation and the Lanai Yoler family, as well as several other families, some in the ALD community and some who very generously have donated from outside of the ALD community. So. Here's the overview. So I'm gonna talk about just a brief history on the premise for vitamin D relevance to ALD. It's still theoretical. We have some early data, I think, at this point still. I'm going to tell you about the update on the vitamin D pilot study, and then I want your feedback from families in particular, and then the PIs and I will probably discuss in more detail about a design later. But let's start with the quick premise here. So this is what we call a natural history curve, meaning what happens without any intervention to date from what we know in history. And let's see. So the blue line here is adrenal insufficiency, and for those of you who may not have seen this before, this is called a survival curve. Every drop in this curve means the number of patients who basically develop symptoms in this time. So here we're basically this 0.8 means about 20. It's basically 20% of boys by age, like let's say 5 or so, and then by age 10, we have about roughly 50% of boys with adrenal insufficiency, and about 30% of boys with cerebral ALD. And this was, by the way, a terrific paper from the Dutch group and Florian's group at MGH. So this is what we have for natural history. It's consistent with some of the other natural history we have, and there is, I think, if you look at the data a little bit differently, this is not the same data set, but a similar one. There's another way to look at this, which is basically what's your percent chance of developing, a cerebral disease in a given year. This is sort of that question, but basically between age 2 and 3, you have about a 2% chance. This is, take this with a grain of salt because it's from an older data set, but it probably might be moved over a little bit if we knew more. Age 4, as your age 3 to 4, you're kind of near to the peak, more than 10%, and then it roughly follows this curve here. So the interesting thing about this curve is that there's something special about this, meaning that the risk is kind of lumped in this first 10 years. Then once you get beyond this, your risk falls. And so I would say this is a good setup for a prevention study where you just have to get boys to the other side of this hurdle, and then perhaps their risk remains a little bit lower from there. And that's one of the I would say that's kind of the major thrust for our lab is kind of thinking about a born healthy, stay healthy paradigm for ALD boys. So prevention, the theme in prevention in one other and a few other diseases revolves around vitamin D, and the disease we're interested in our lab. So I see kids with multiple sclerosis and kids with ALD. And it's been long known and studied. The relationship of vitamin D and multiple sclerosis is very well established. It both predicts and to some extent treats multiple sclerosis. These diseases are quite similar. So they both have inflammatory demyelination and lesions. They have some radiologic similarities. And we said, well, if they're similar here and vitamin D works for MS, let's see if it works in ALD. And so we did this. I've shown this slide a couple of times. So this is basically suggesting that vitamin D may be lower in kids who later go on to develop cerebral ALD. And so this prompted a trial, which is a pilot trial. It's really a dose-finding trial. Where target was enrollment of 20 boys with 2 different doses. There's kind of a medium dose and a high dose with a conditional dose escalation with standard of care otherwise applied. We had 2 sites, Stanford and then Kennedy Krieger, and the goal of this if this is to basically generate safety and dosing data for an efficacy trial if it looked feasible. And so I'll update you on the current trial, and then I want your input on efficacy trial design. So here's our enrollment curve. We had our first patient enroll at the end of 2016, and our last patient enroll about 3 years later. These are mostly newborn screening boys that came in, and our last study visit is in May, so we'll basically be able to perform a full trial analysis sometime this spring and summer. Okay. Here's the age and weight distribution. We're looking at mostly younger boys. We did have a few older patients or older boys enroll. Safety data looked good. We had 4 patients whose levels went above our safety threshold. They didn't have symptoms. Their calcium levels were not deviated. They were otherwise doing well. But we had enough patients go high that we actually modified our dosing regimen. This is the purpose of the trial, is actually to figure out, what are the doses we would want to use in a longer-term trial. We had a few patients with sporadic elevations in urine calcium creatinine, asymptomatic, self-resolved. This is potentially neither here nor there at this point, but it's worth following because chronic elevated vitamin D levels and high calcium levels can predispose to kidney stones, and that's not something we want to meddle with. But we had no vitamin D related clinical adverse events that caused any symptoms of any kind to date. Here are the dosing parameters. This is where each boy started, and this is where their vitamin D levels went over time. These 4 colors here are the 4 boys who went above our safety threshold. We had parameters in place that required a dose de-escalation, and then after we had 4 boys experience this, we actually just changed the regimen altogether. So we started with a regimen of basically 2,000 for the first 6 months, and then pretty consistent elevation to 4,000 after that. This turns out to be too high for most of the kids in this time to do it chronically. This is a summary of our newer regimen with a conditional escalation as listed here. Something like this, probably not exactly this, but something like this will be the kind of dosing regimen we'd use for a later trial. This is an overview just of a deep analysis of what we plan to get out of the trial. This is its primary purpose, was dose response and safety. We have some secondary outcomes regarding glutathione, which we haven't looked at yet. This is an antioxidant marker, which we had some prelim data suggest that may be helpful in upregulating antioxidant status. And then we'll be looking at some other parameters here, including, so far we've had no boys develop clear new lesions in the study, so that's good, though we're not powered to look for effect. So we don't know if from this study, we knew we wouldn't, and we can't, whether vitamin D works to prevent ALD, and let's make that clear. To do that, we need a study that includes, like, our rough power analysis means more than 200 patients for probably a couple of years. That's a lot of patients for a population like ours. This is really going to be the challenge if we want to do a definitive study. We have many layers here. This is kind of a multi-omic analysis where we're planning to basically dive into the mechanism of vitamin D, and it might be relevant to ALD boys. I won't delve into that in this talk. That we'll save that for another time next year. But I do. That is part of the plan here. So now, questions maybe real quick on the current trial. Any questions on the trial before I move on to design this pilot study? No. Yes, Justin. Yes, or daily oral dosing, right? That's correct. Yep. Okay. All right, so here are some of the challenges to trial design. You have to first understand the severity of the illness you're trying to treat or prevent, right? And I'd say that, cerebral ALD, it's not fatal, but nobody wants a bone marrow transplant unless they need it. So I would put this as sort of on the severe end, somewhere up there. Vitamin D is not going to, definitively is not going to stop all boys from getting cerebral disease. It's not going to happen. But it is our goal to perhaps our goal is to ask the question of, does vitamin D prevent some boys from getting cerebral disease? Or does it prevent some boys from getting adrenal insufficiency? Those are the questions we want to ask. It's not a cure, but I would say, since we're not fixing 100%, but it is, a prevention is, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So let's say prevention is very valuable. It's not going to be 100% preventive, but it will, our goal is to ask if it's at all preventive. Safe, it's pretty safe, the doses we're planning to use. There are some risks of side effects here, with hypercalcemia, kidney stones included. But at the doses we'll be using, it should not be. That's the purpose of our pilot study here. Alternatives, I put many, because I think when you're designing a trial, you want to know what are the options to your trial to achieve the same goals. And I'd say the primary option to a trial in this case is just go to your local grocery store and you get vitamin D there, and you don't need a trialist to do that. And I think that's the challenge to actually answering a clinical question in some ways. And I think that's the kind of the principal challenge we're working around here is, how do we design a study that is frictionless enough, has few enough disincentives to be able to encourage people to join it and still answer a meaningful question. And that really is, that's a hassle of the trial. So how much friction and what kind of hoops do you have to jump through to be part of a trial? And then the family capacity and motivation. This is dependent partly on the disease and partly on the circumstances of the family. So for families with very few resources, lots of kids or lots of competing needs, the hassle of a trial is going to be maybe a deal breaker. And then we want to turn this into something that provides as definitive an answer as we can get on a specific question. All right. So we have to figure out how to navigate this to get to as close to a good answer as we can. And so how do we design a trial that I would say offers both potential to benefit all participants? I think that's a good goal, and still offers a real shot at answering a core question, which is, does vitamin D prevent anything in ALD? And I'd say again, our goal is to get, can we get more boys? Can we flatten this curve in a sense? Can we reduce some of this risk? So one way to do that, of course, is to focus on this population where basically this is the highest period of risk. That's where you kind of want to focus your question. That's what we'll probably do there. So we'll probably look at age 0 to 9 enrollment. So pre-symptomatic ALD, either without one or the other symptoms, without adrenal disease or without cerebral disease, only boys, and then 0 to 9 years of age. We'll have some exclusionary labs, and then this is essentially a roadmap here, but we'd have a recruitment discussion, and then we'd have to say, okay, will you agree to some number of years of travel and monitoring? This is the hassle part. And some families will say, oh, yeah, sure, I'll do whatever I have to do this, even if it's something I can get in my local grocery store. Others will say, no, I don't need to do that. I'm fine, we don't need extra hassle in our life right now. Thank you very much. So for those that consent, we'd then basically, this would be kind of like the classical option. You say, okay, we're going to randomize you to either, a regular treatment or no treatment, or a high dose or a low dose. This is the classical trial design. Typically you randomize to placebo. In this case, we could do something like a high dose, low dose. And then for those that decline, they would be lost in a sense to the study. They'd maybe have no other follow-up clearly, or some version of that. And then exposure, we'd say, okay, how did the high dose do? How did the low dose group do? What were the incidence rates year on year? We could look, we can use various analytical measures to sort of normalize to each patient's particular year of risk. We can ask some additional questions that get at, two mechanistic hypotheses, and then we can build some biological models to basically around, what basically transcription pathways changed, and how did the lipid profiles change, et cetera. So this would be the classical design. I'm going to pose this as option 1, in a sense, basically a randomized trial, okay? And then I'm going to propose an alternate trial, which I want to pitch to you here, but I want to first put forward this framework here. So this is really the question that most people try to answer first. This is called efficacy. Does the drug work in a perfect setting, like in a highly controlled laboratory, basically a clinical trial is kind of a laboratory for as a for like human trials, where everything is really rigid. It does not always reflect clinical practice. So what happens in a trial is not always going to happen when it disseminates into the real world, where you don't have all the trial coordinators doing all the work of tracking down the patients and measuring their compliance and all these things. That is actually a different kind of, that's looking at a different basically effect, and that's effectiveness. Now, these are similar sounding terms that in medical lingo have different meanings. And effectiveness asks the question of, does this intervention, whatever it may be, does it work in the wild? Like, so, like if you know that appendectomies work in a clinical trial, do appendectomies still work when you're doing it in, in like a community hospital in Iowa, somewhere, somewhere remote, right? And that's often asked in the setting of a large database. But I think actually there's a way for us to maybe build in a way to ask both these questions. And the value of asking this question now, or asking both these questions at the same time, is it helps us understand, if this drug works, what are the barriers to kind of disseminating the care? And how can we basically write it? Because I would say currently we're sort of doing an effectiveness trial now, because some patients are sort of on vitamin D or some are not, and I would say those that are on vitamin D are maybe more likely going to be at an expert center, but probably most children are not really being treated with it in any particular way. That might be exactly what it looks like outside of the expert centers once we finish an efficacy trial. And so one challenge is to figure out, well, let's say we find something that works, like how do we really deliver a standard of care nationally? And I would pose this as sort of a tandem and complementary, problem here. Is we are facing a problem how to democratize the standard of care for all the new boys who are being diagnosed via newborn screening. And so this is basically an estimate. I think it's a reasonably accurate so far of how many boys have been diagnosed directly via newborn screening now, and right now it's at about 170-ish for boys is my estimate, nationally through newborn screening in all states. And then our predictions are this is going to steadily rise as more states begin screening, and each state's beginning. So this is boys diagnosed each year. And this is cumulative boys diagnosed, and this is a prediction. It's based on incidence estimates and so on, but it's going to look something in this ballpark. So in 2023, we're going to have up to 600 children that need a standard of care delivered to them, and this is going to be one of the challenges our community is going to be facing increasingly. And here's part of that challenge is. These are, I would say, expert centers that are likely to deliver like a good standard of care for these boys. These are centers that we all know people at, and will probably be able to do this. And then there are other major academic centers where they'll probably also be able to do this. But much of this map is not going to be covered, and some of these states that are not covered are also screening. So the question is, how do we get, no matter where you live, how do we get a good standard of care to you? And I think this is an opportunity to maybe build in a grant or a trial proposal that tries to do both, where the main thrust of the grant is to deliver the current standard of care of like routine MRIs and routine blood endocrine labs, and then within that, ask a question about vitamin D's effect. I think this is an opportunity to do that. Perhaps it'd be an interesting and maybe challenging trial design, but this is how we might do it. If we were able to build a large registry of boys enrolled here, and then over time, let's say some boys, if we're looking only at their vitamin D levels, we would know, let's say we predicted a particular target range of a blood level to be helpful, and then below that some target range or above some target range that would be not helpful. And we use that level rather than just the medicine itself, whether they got medicine or not, to actually determine whether they were exposed. So a positive exposure would mean they got a blood level that was sufficient for a given period of time, and a not exposed was out of range. And then some boys may develop a lesion regardless of whether they had the right exposure or not. And then others would have no lesion, and we could compare the groups. And this is this is an alternate to a randomized trial. We would know a lot of the parameters up front. We'd be following continuously, and I think the neat thing here is that we could offer the option for all families to basically get access to vitamin D if they want. And the idea would be, and make the trial access very easy. So that one idea would be basically, we have an effectiveness kind of an observation arm that for families who we said, well, do you want to travel? If you can travel to our site, we can do some extra things, and we'll provide the drug and so on. And then but wherever you are, if you'd rather not travel or you don't want the hassle of doing all the extra things of the trial, you can just we'll basically give you the drug recommendations. We'll help deliver the current standard of care of regular MRIs and labs by setting up a good system that communicates with your doctors when you need the MRIs, et cetera, and we collect the data centrally. And we collect, in the meantime, kind of a double-blind vitamin D level. And then we have an efficacy arm where basically everybody gets like highly managed. This is the perfect, idealized, highly structured trial. So everyone here would basically be given the dosing regimens that everybody gets equal access to the dosing regimens. One group would basically be the idealized setting. They would get everything provided for them. All the work is done at the centers. And the others would be kind of like the clinical practice now, which I can tell you from caring for children with multiple sclerosis. Say, okay, this is the vitamin D level you should be taking. There's no meaning for me to prescribe it for you because your insurance generally doesn't pay for it. So find a pharmacy that provides it, take it, and I'll check your level again in a while or whatever. And that's kind of the standard. So that's in the wild. Does it work in the wild? Does it really work in the wild? And then it gives us a whole bunch of ways to ask like potential questions of like, let's just say this is like our target range. I don't know this will for sure be the target range, but something like it might be. Say, okay, whether or not you were at either of these arms, let's look at all the kids who had a target range over a given year, and let's look at their outcome at the end of that year. And then for any of those that were off target, let's look, did they have a different outcome for the adrenal function or for cerebral disease? The investigators and the patients would all be blinded to these levels during the study. So no one would know. You would just have the option to take the drug at the doses we've determined are likely to be safe and effective, or in terms of achieving a level. And then we would ask the same questions at the end about did we hit our targets, and then we could build same kind of molecular constructs to answer more mechanistic questions. And I would say that the things that it would be different would be one arm wouldn't have to travel necessarily. One arm would have the vitamin D supplied, one wouldn't. We'd have a kind of like a very precise blood capture for one arm that it would require more blood draws perhaps, or different kinds of blood draws. We'd embed this as relative to some other aspects of the trial, like a little Fitbit watch in one arm of the trial. But again, one is basically asking the idealized question: if we do everything perfectly, does it work? And the other is asking, does it work in the real world? And whether you're in either arm, you have access to the vitamin D. If you want it, your compliance is, we'll work on it with you, but we won't know to really the end of the study to look at how your vitamin D levels did. And then we would be able to ask us the questions. And if we had no real difference in these arms, like let's say everyone in both arms they were all in the effective range, the fallback would be our existing natural history data, and we would compare the data to natural history, probably no matter what. But this is the fallback. If everyone winds up with basically a positive exposure in a perfect setting, this would be our comparison. But more likely, some boys will have periods where they're taking the drug and not. This is true of our current trial and of any trial you run. There's a compliance issue, and our biology is different. So we still will know. We'll basically be finding out if some range of vitamin D levels, I suspect. And so here's what I would say, ask maybe for a vote on. The real question is, would any family would people be willing to enroll in a trial where one arm of the trial was basically intentionally providing a low dose? And my instinct is that probably some people would. They say, yes, I want to help science. We want to figure this out. But I know what I would do, and I wouldn't enroll my child in this trial. So, but I, but I would say, listen, if you think this works, I'm gonna take this at home, and that's that's also as a doctor, that's what probably most of us would prefer. This is a pretty safe thing, and we're supposed to be taking this anyway. Like, why don't we just do it? The alternate trial basically asks it provides better full access to a wide range of patients. We can try and implement standard of care, and then ask within that trial, does the standard of care work, and what didn't work in getting the vitamin D to patients in these remote geographic regions. And these aren't mutually exclusive necessarily. We could try to do both, but I do think the deal breaker is in some cases the idea of randomizing it. And I wanted to, I guess, get feedback from the audience on this particular point. Um, any thoughts from families, because on how they might view randomization in a trial like this or other trials? This is where I'd like to get feedback from people. Or even just like a clear, I want to do this trial, or why aren't you doing it a different way, or something like that. That is okay.
So I think it would depend exactly on how it's introduced to the family. Because I think we were introduced to it. We have now this great understanding and this background and all the rest of it. And so having all of that introduction, I'd be like, well, gee, I know that I've heard all these studies. Vitamin D seems to provide different. No, I don't want to do the low dose one, right? But I guess part of my response to your question is how will it be presented, and how much background information will the families be given to when they are participating in this trial?
That's a very savvy question, because it gets to the idea of what is really an informed consent, and how do we standardize an informed consent. Normally right now informed consent, it will vary from day to day, even if the same person does it. And if you've ever been enrolled in a trial, it will certainly vary from site to site. My thought here is we might even have something like a video to describe the trial a bit, or to standardize the enrollment a bit more. But I think that we can all agree that it is unknown whether there's a real effect here. But I think the thing that is also pretty clear is the risk of kind of a medium dose of vitamin D is pretty low. And I think what we're shooting for here is enrollment of several hundred boys. So I'm sure some families would be willing to enroll, no matter what we told them. The way we would probably try to structure it is we'd probably describe the reason we're doing the trial is because we think there's a possible benefit to a higher level of vitamin D versus a lower level of vitamin D. And if I were a family member hearing that, I would think one thing. I would think, well, I want to be in the higher arm if this is going to work, right? So we would have to, I think, as part of the consent, we want to, for one, be open with families and make sure that they understand as much as we understand with a reason, with a reasonable amount of doubt. The doubt we have is we don't really know if it works. And so a lot of things that look good, they don't really do much, or the magnitude effect might be so tiny we just can't even measure it. We would describe some possible benefit, and that's the reason we do in the trial. But I think and everyone would agree that we don't really know that it's a benefit. Yeah. So it's a subtle question. It's a good question. Yeah, Steve?
Yeah, I think I'm a father of two sons, and I probably would enroll both of my sons to low dose because what we do not really know is if the benefit we're going to get with vitamin D can be easily get in low dose too, because we're trying to bring it up to a level, and above that the extra dose may not be needed. But for safety reason, you already showed in some kids higher dose has some mild but has some effect. So it's very likely that you bring it up to a lower dose and they'll get an equal benefit, and safety will learn. So I think there is a rationale for going to low dose too, because you can get a benefit without probably no harm.
Yeah, I think that's a very important consideration, right? It's like maybe all that's needed is a whiff of something, if anything. And the less you expose your child to, the lower the risk would be.
Yeah. I had a similar reaction, thinking that we don't, the low dose versus the high dose, you don't know which one is actually better. Maybe they're both effective. So our son's older than the the children you'd be recruiting, but I think we'd be open to enrolling our son in a study like that. My question for you is, why would you not be doing more of a dose ranging study? Because it looked like you were trying to get each child to a certain range versus just sticking with a low dose and a high dose.
Good question. Do you mean why don't we have several different arms in the study?
No,
Or
you're designing the study with a low dose and a high dose. I've seen study designs where you have a dose range where you're trying to get everybody to within a certain level. So that doesn't mean that one would start with a low dose or a high dose. It's dependent on how much that person needs to get within the range that you're working towards.
like titrating to a certain
exactly,
to
yeah.
a certain level. Yeah, it's something. It would be an alternate. We'd have to unblind to do it. Perhaps you could do it without unblinding, I suppose. But we could do that. Titrate one to a certain level and another one to another level. There is, I think, what has been seen in most vitamin D studies is there's a threshold effect. And I actually did I. It's funny. I must have taken that slide out. I might have it a little bit later here. Let me see. Maybe. Well, I think I must have taken it out. Beyond a certain level of vitamin D, so once you get above like 35 or 40, the effect sort of plateaus. And so it may be true that for all patients in some range, there's really no difference in effect, and it's only patients below a certain range that there's any real effect. So there's risk below a range, but basically a steady, stable risk above. So it may not be much of a dose dependence. And it's a challenging trial design for that reason too, meaning 5-point change if you're already above the threshold has no meaning. But a 5-point change if you're below the threshold is important. That's actually what the vitamin D literature looks like. There's a specific threshold and there's a plateau. And that threshold and plateau kind of exists somewhere between the range of 20 to 40. Yeah.
So we don't have a newborn either, but the one thing that would cross my mind is this is very different than like the Min 102, where you're asking someone to potentially take a placebo, or in this case a low dose, for 2 years and then be given the actual drug. AMN is such a slow-moving disease, and there's not a risk of morbidity.
Yeah.
It's more of a gait issue. If I had a newborn and I'm looking at that, and there's a period of 5 years that there's a risk of a deadly disease, I don't think I'd want to take the chance with a low dose. I would rather take the full dose. I would just say, hey, thanks for the tip. I'm going to go down to Walgreens.
Yeah.
So and again, I kind of think it's a great to figure out what the dose is, but the second plan, I think if you got people to take it and you just monitored the vitamin D level, and you could see people with this vitamin D level got a substantially lower percentage of cerebral ALD or not, it seems like that would be good beneficial, and I think you could get a lot more people in there if you say this would be a good standard of care to take this vitamin D.
Yeah, that's kind of what the second trial is, sort of an observational trial with extra vitamin D added in a sense as intervention. Yeah, thanks. Florian.
Purple. Yeah, good. Fantastic challenge to take on, Keith here. So, and I commend you putting all these different designs together. Part of the challenge here is, as you are looking at different signals and thinking about outcomes over time, and how your goal, as you put it, is to come up with a definitive answer, and I worry about that. Particularly as I see many adults and young adults in their 20s who have perfectly normal brain MRIs and low vitamin D levels, and I worry about the scenario where you're starting to get people to think, oh, I'm now in trouble because my vitamin D level is low, and how to manage that, trying at the same time to establish some relationship, between these levels and an event. So I wonder if there's a better way at getting at inflammatory markers in a short-term, mechanistic way because no matter what, in a large trial, you're going to have multiple different events, not just vitamin D. You're going to have head trauma. You're going to have other things occurring, and they're going to be confounders. And how are you going to sort that out? And so, hope you don't mind if I'm sort of putting a bit of a challenge to that. The other thing is sort of that standard of care aspect, which I like democratizing standard of care. Conflating that with a trial becomes difficult because I would also hate to sort of see the trial being, or the vitamin D intake now being seen as a standard of care.
You're right. I think that's a good point of just the ideas getting confused. I think the idea is to actually, it's sort of setting up the cohort in which you can ask the question. So to set up the cohort, the idea would be to offer the advantage. And you basically set up a cohort where people agree to be monitored. And so it's basically setting up the backdrop from which to draw the observations. But there's sort of like a writing of the grant for how do you write the grants, and then there's also how do you describe the trial. They would probably be done, they could be done independently, actually, where basically the standard of care would only include a kind of an experimental blood draw that would be centralized somehow. And within that blood draw could be included something like vitamin D. But I think it's an important point that when you're talking about standard of care and you're talking about some experimental arm in standard of care, it does get complicated. As for the other random events happening, I think that's part of every trial background, and that's where you have to. A few events could actually, if it's a very small effect size, you're in a very small sample size, you're out of luck. That's just the nature of the beast in a sense. I think for a trial for a longitude this is going to require a long period of observation. Yeah. So, no, the question would be, should it be a standard of care? Like, right,
I mean, my daughter was born, she doesn't have ALD, she's a girl. The standard of care was she should be on vitamin D and her vitamin D, monitoring. And so my question is more, there's a minimum, right? So there are some specific pediatric recommendations for dosing in kids, like the minimum dosing. That would be provided too, a trial like this. You'd have to say, what's the basic standard of care for all children, and then what's kind of the experimental version of this. And so that will be part of it, be built in. So, but again, it becomes a compliance issue. I don't know how you did with your vitamin D dosing for your daughter, but most people's compliance for things like that are not very good. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in these patients, have you looked at, or do you plan to look at the vitamin D metabolizing enzymes, whether their levels are differentially affected in the disease phenotypes, and that may also affect the dose which you are giving, whether they are able to metabolize that or not?
Yeah, I think the trial design would involve probably at a minimum of titration. The after effects of this, the results that say we could look at other metabolomic markers or proteomic markers or genomic markers, but that will be relevant to dosing and for possibly to some interpretation of exposure. Questions? I shouldn't stay here long because we're running out of time and I'm going over time. So real quick, I just want to play, I may have actually leave in the middle of this video, but I did want to play okay, sorry. Go ahead. So this is, so we put together a retreat for ALD families. So the Allison Adler, who we have over there, her husband Nick, and her kids, and I started thinking about the idea of an ALD retreat. We're going to try and host it this spring, May 1st to the 3rd, at a site in California. It's a children's camp founded by Paul Newman and Allison's mother-in-law. So it's called the Painted Turtle. It's we wanted to help bring families together to more focus on the idea of building community and making connections. It's designed to be somewhat relaxing here. So it's a retreat that's not really educational so much as a way to help people connect, help their children sort of interact with other kids with ALD, meet other families who are affected. And we did it when we started, had in mind a newborn screening population. We think that population may be too few to maybe fill a whole retreat, and we wanted to make sure that other families in the ALD community also felt welcome to join too. And I'll let okay. So I may not be here when this finishes, but
like many families, Allison and I, we got a phone call 3 months after our son Lucas was born, and the doctor told us we needed to come in. They let us know that something came up on the newborn screen, and that happened to be ALD. For months and months, looked for doctors, tried to find information, and really just felt isolated until we went to our first ALD Connect. Not only were there other families, but there was also a lot of doctors and companies working towards prevention, cure, early diagnosis, understanding really what we were going through and that we weren't the only ones.
So when I met Nick and Allison, they were describing their experience, and it really struck me how much it resonated with the experience that my family had with our son's rare disease. He has a rare blood malignancy. And we were really dealing with many of the same worries and concerns and treatment paradigms of things that should work, but there's always the what ifs kinds of questions. And also things we could do to help make the community that our family was in a bit better. As a doctor caring for families with many different conditions, particularly ALD, I feel like sometimes I worry that some of the things we think are going to help and be good may help some of the symptoms, but they don't really make the family's life different or better. Yeah. And I think that is an interesting angle to take as a physician, because I also follow some of the wellness literature where perhaps the single most powerful aspect that comes through all these happiness, wellness, longevity studies is the degree of social connection that you feel with other people.
The current conferences that we go to are geared primarily, if not 100%, towards the adults. And what we're trying to do is also create that experience for the kids. We started to look around at our own resources, and that's when something that was very close to us kind of came to mind, the painted turtle, which was created 15 years ago by a group of amazing people, 2 of them being my father, Lou, and my mom, Paige. And the reason that they put this camp together was to help kids be kids and help families become stronger. And so with the Painted Turtle staff and Dr. Van Huren and a group of parents and families who've been through so much through ALD, we've really got a good idea of what this retreat should look like.
We really kind of conceived of this retreat and intended it to be for really any family in the ALD community who maybe particularly didn't feel like they were part of a community yet. And we wanted people to feel like there was a safe place to have early conversations that tries to leave time for connection, relaxation, and a little bit of education and information, but not too heavy. It's a very powerful thing to meet other families going through what otherwise feels like a very isolating experience. It begins to break down barriers that you probably didn't realize were there.